The wind has teeth tonight. It bites through the thin fabric of her shawl, a predator of ice and fury that hunts the high plains. Lena stumbles, one arm wrapped tight around the shivering bundle that is her son, Samuel, the other hand held out before her, a blind ward against the swirling white that has swallowed the world. Every landmark, every sense of direction, is gone, consumed by the blizzard. Hope is a dying ember, and the cold is a thief stealing the last of its warmth. Her legs are numb, her lungs burn, and the only thing keeping her upright is the small, precious weight in her arms. He stirs, a weak whimper muffled against her collarbone. "Almost there, my love," she whispers, the words snatched away by the gale. It is a lie. There is no there. There is only this endless, howling whiteness. Then, through the chaos, a flicker, a soft, yellow square of light, impossibly distant, yet a beacon in the maelstrom. It's a phantom, surely, a trick of her freezing, exhausted mind. But it doesn't vanish. It holds steady. A window, a house, shelter. With the last dregs of her strength, she changes course, lurching toward the light like a moth drawn to a flame. The distance is a cruel deception. Each step is a monumental effort, her boots sinking into the deepening drifts. The light grows, resolves itself into the solid shape of a cabin, a curl of smoke battling the wind from its stone chimney. She reaches the porch, a low, snow-dusted structure, and collapses against a rough-hewn post, her body finally surrendering. She can't knock. She can't call out. All she can do is huddle over her son, a final, desperate act of maternal protection as the world begins to fade to a peaceful, terrifying black. That was a close call. Before we see how our heroine navigates this, tell us in the comments, what's the toughest situation you've ever had to survive? And if you admire pure grit, hit that like button and subscribe. The door creaked open. Elias Thorne stood silhouetted against the warm light of his home, a rifle held loosely in one hand. He'd heard a sound over the blizzard's roar, a thud against the porch post that was not the wind. He expected a wolf, or perhaps a branch torn from the cottonwoods down by the creek. He did not expect a woman and child, half buried in a snowdrift at his very feet. For a long moment, he simply stared, his mind struggling to process the impossible sight. They looked like a Madonna and child sculpted from ice and despair. He saw the ragged shawl, the pale, unconscious face of the woman, and the small, still form clutched to her chest. A curse escaped his lips, low and harsh. Solitude was the law of this land, a law he had lived by for 5 long years, ever since Martha. He shook the thought away. This was no time for ghosts. He set the rifle by the door, bent down, and carefully, awkwardly, gathered the woman into his arms. She was lighter than he expected, a fragile weight against his chest. As he lifted her, the child stirred, letting out a thin, frightened cry. Elias's heart, a muscle he thought had turned to stone, gave a painful lurch. He carried her inside, kicking the door shut against the raging storm, and laid her gently on the rag rug before the hearth. The child, a boy of no more than 4, began to cry in earnest, his small hands still clinging to his mother's coat. Elias knelt, his large, calloused hands clumsy as he worked the boy free from his mother's grasp. "Easy now, son. You're safe." The boy looked at him with wide, terrified blue eyes, tears freezing on his pale cheeks. Elias unwrapped the boy's threadbare blanket and wrapped him instead in a thick wool one from the back of his own chair. He set him on the chair, a small, trembling figure swallowed by the furniture, and turned his attention back to the woman. He didn't know who she was or what trouble she carried, but as he looked at the small, desperate family huddled by his fire, he knew he couldn't turn them away. Elias Thorne's world was one of wood, leather, and silence. His cabin, a single sturdy room he'd built with his own hands, was a fortress against the unforgiving Wyoming landscape. Out here, a man's closest neighbors were the mountains on the horizon and the ghosts in his memory. 4 or 5 years since his wife, Martha, and their infant daughter had been taken by fever, the silence had been his constant companion, first an enemy, now a familiar, if somber, friend. His life was a rhythm of hard work, tending his small herd of cattle, mending fences, chopping wood, and staring into the fire at night with a heart as empty as the plains outside. Now, that silence was broken. It was fractured by the soft crackle of the fire, the whisper of the lingering wind outside, and two new, alien sounds: the quiet, steady breathing of the sleeping woman and the occasional sniffle from the little boy, who had cried himself to sleep in Elias's armchair. Elias sat on a stool, watching them. The woman, Lena, she had murmured her name before exhaustion fully claimed her, was pale, but her breathing was even. The snow had melted from her dark hair, which fanned out on the rough rug. She was young, younger than he'd first thought, with a face that held the ghost of a beauty worn down by hardship. Her clothes were patched but clean, her hands raw and chapped. She was not dressed for a blizzard. She was dressed for running. The boy, Samuel, was a miniature of his mother, with the same dark hair and a small, determined chin. In his sleep, his face was smooth with an innocence that felt achingly familiar to Elias. It was a face like the one he kept locked away in the deepest part of his mind. He looked from the boy to the woman, and a question burned in his throat. What kind of desperation drove a mother to carry her child into the teeth of a storm like this? He saw the worn soles of her boots, propped near the fire to dry. He saw the way her hand, even in unconsciousness, was curled as if still holding onto her son. This wasn't recklessness, it was a flight from something worse than the storm. He felt a grim certainty settle in his gut. Trouble had washed up on his shore, and he, a man who had sworn off the complications of the world, was now its harbinger. He got up, banked the fire for the night, and pulled his own cot closer to the hearth. He would sleep on the floor. The woman and her child could have the only bed. It was a simple, practical decision, but it felt like the first step onto a path from which there was no turning back. Lena woke to the smell of coffee and wood smoke. For a moment, she was adrift, unsure of where she was. The last thing she remembered was the soul-crushing cold, the weight of Samuel, the light. She sat up abruptly, a wave of panic washing over her. Samuel? He's right here. The voice was a low rumble, like stones shifting. She saw him then, a tall, broad-shouldered man standing by the hearth, a tin cup in his hand. He gestured with his chin toward a large armchair, where her son was still fast asleep, tucked under a thick wool blanket. Relief washed through her so intensely it left her weak. She looked around the cabin. It was sparse but solid. A sturdy table, 2 chairs, a cot pushed against the far wall, and the stone fireplace that dominated the room. Her wet clothes and boots were laid out neatly to dry. The man who had saved them was watching her, his expression unreadable. He had a weathered face, a thick beard threaded with gray, and eyes the color of a winter sky. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "You saved us." He gave a short, non-committal nod. "Storm's breaking. You were lucky I heard you." He crossed the room and handed her a cup of coffee. It was black and strong, and the warmth spread through her hands, chasing away the last of the chill. "There's bacon and biscuits, if you're hungry." She was starving, but her first thought was for her son. "May I?" "Let him sleep," the man said. "He's warm. Food will keep." They sat in a strained silence, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Lena sipped her coffee, studying the man over the rim of her cup. He was not what she expected. There was a hardness to him, the quiet authority of a man long accustomed to solitude, but his actions spoke of a deep-seated decency. He had taken them in, tended to them, given up his own chair and likely his bed, all without a single question. "I'm Elias Thorne," he said finally, as if realizing he hadn't introduced himself. "Lena Walker. And my son, Samuel." She hesitated, knowing what must come next, the explanation he was owed. I'm sorry to have imposed on you. We were heading for Dusty Creek, but we got lost in the snow." It was a half-truth. They were heading west, anywhere west, but had no specific destination. Elias's gaze was steady. He didn't press, but she felt he could see the holes in her story. "Dusty Creek's a good 2 days' walk from here, even in fair weather. Another day by wagon. You wouldn't have made it." The simple statement held no judgment, only fact. The silence stretched again. Lena knew she should offer to leave as soon as the storm passed completely, but the thought of facing the cold, empty wilderness again sent a shard of fear through her. Here, in this rough cabin, with this quiet, formidable man, she felt a sliver of safety she hadn't known in months. Samuel stirred in the chair, murmuring in his sleep. His small, peaceful face was a stark reminder of what was at stake. She had fled her late husband's family home to keep him from a life of virtual servitude. Her brother-in-law, Jedediah, a man as cruel as he was greedy, saw Samuel not as a nephew, but as a future unpaid farmhand, a piece of property he was entitled to. He had made it clear he would take the boy, and she would be sent packing. The fearful memory of Jedediah's cold eyes and possessive hands made her shiver. Elias noticed the tremor. "The storm will have passed by midday," he said, his voice still low and even. "But the drifts will be deep. The road won't be clear for days." He wasn't telling her to go. He wasn't telling her to stay. He was simply stating a fact, leaving the decision hanging in the air between them. For the first time, Lena felt a flicker of something other than fear. It was a fragile, unfamiliar thing, choice. The blizzard passed, leaving behind a world transformed. The plains were an endless sea of sculpted white under a painfully bright sun. The silence that returned was different now, punctuated by the small sounds of three people sharing a space meant for one. For 3 days, they were snowbound. Elias said little, but his actions were a language Lena was beginning to understand. He made sure the fire never died. He shared his stores of food without comment, giving the largest portions of meat to Samuel. He'd even produced a small, whittled horse from a trunk, a toy he said he'd made a long time ago, and gave it to the boy. Samuel, after his initial fear, began to blossom in the warmth and stability of the cabin. He followed Elias around like a small shadow, watching him mend a bridle or sharpen an axe. Elias, for his part, tolerated the boy's presence with a quiet stoicism that slowly softened. Lena saw him once, when he thought she wasn't looking, show Samuel how to properly stack kindling, his large hand guiding the boy's small one. The sight caused a strange ache in her chest. On the 4th morning, Elias announced, "I have to check the herd. Some may have drifted south." Lena's heart sank. This was it. He was leaving, and they would be expected to be gone when he returned. She gathered her courage. "We'll be on our way, then, Mr. Thorne. I can't thank you enough for your kindness." He was pulling on his heavy coat and didn't look at her. Roads still impassable on foot. "And where would you go?" The question was blunt, but not unkind. I'll find work. In a town." He finally turned to face her, his gaze direct. "What kind of work?" "I can cook. I can clean, mend, do laundry. I'm a hard worker." He considered her for a long moment. He looked at her worn hands, her tired eyes, and then his gaze shifted to Samuel, who was sitting by the fire, carefully arranging a line of pebbles. Elias's own cabin was a testament to his self-sufficiency, but it was a man's space, functional, stark, and lacking any touch of warmth beyond the fire itself. His meals were simple, his mending was clumsy, and the dust was a permanent resident in the corners. "This is a big land," he said slowly, his voice a low burr. "And a hard one. A woman and child alone. It's no place for you." He paused, and she held her breath. "I need help around here. The place is too much for one man. Mending, cooking, tending a garden. Come spring," he looked away, toward the fire. "You can stay. Earn your keep. It's safer than the road." The offer hung in the air, as stark and solid as the cabin walls. It was not an offer of charity. It was a practical arrangement, a transaction, shelter for labor. But for Lena, it was a lifeline. It was a roof over her son's head. It was a reprieve from the terror of the unknown. Her eyes filled with tears, and she blinked them back fiercely. She would not show this man weakness. "I accept," she said, her voice clear and steady. "We will not be a burden to you, Mr. Thorne." "Elias," he corrected gruffly, turning back to the door. "My name is Elias." He pulled his hat down low and stepped out into the blinding white, leaving Lena and Samuel standing in the quiet warmth of what was, for now, their home. The arrangement was sealed not with a handshake, but with the quiet rhythm of shared days. A new routine settled over the cabin, as delicate as the first spring thaw. Lena arose before dawn, coaxing the embers in the hearth back to life, filling the small space with the scent of coffee and frying bacon. She discovered Elias's stores were more meager than he let on and began to manage them with a careful economy, making every scrap of flour and every strip of jerky last. She scrubbed the floors, washed the few windows until they shone, and mended Elias's worn shirts with neat, almost invisible stitches. The cabin began to transform. A jar of winter berries she found preserved in the cellar appeared on the table. A spare piece of flour sacking became a new, clean curtain over the window. These were small things, but in the starkness of Elias's world, they were monumental. Elias watched it all with a guarded quietness. He would return from a long day on the range, bone-weary and half-frozen, to the smell of stew simmering over the fire and the sight of Samuel playing quietly on the floor. He found his socks darned, a button sewn back on his coat, his bedroll tidied. He never commented, but he would leave an extra portion of firewood by the door or bring back a brace of rabbits for the pot. Their communication was a language of gestures, of deeds done and needs met without the clutter of words. The awkwardness of their shared space was a constant negotiation. The cabin was a single room. Lena and Samuel slept on the cot, while Elias had reclaimed his bedroll by the fire. A blanket hung from a rope provided a sliver of privacy, a flimsy but respected border. In the evenings, the three of them would sit in the small circle of light cast by the lantern. Elias would clean his tack or oil his rifle, his presence a solid, reassuring wall of silence. Lena would sew, her needle dipping in and out of fabric. And Samuel, the bridge between their two solitary worlds, would sit between them, playing with his whittled horse or listening as Lena read to him from the one book she'd managed to carry with her, a worn copy of Grimm's fairy tales. One evening, as Lena's soft voice filled the cabin with a story of brave children and dark forests, she glanced up to find Elias watching them. His hands were still, the piece of leather he was working forgotten in his lap. His expression was one she hadn't seen before, a profound, aching loneliness that he quickly masked when he saw her looking. In that moment, she understood that she and Samuel had not just found shelter in his home, they had breached the walls of his solitude. As the snows began to recede, revealing the pale, winter-dead grass beneath, Elias started taking Samuel out with him for short periods. He showed the boy how to check for animal tracks, how to tell the difference between a hawk and an eagle. He even began carving a small flock of animals for him, a wolf, a bear, a deer. Samuel, who had been so timid and quiet, began to chatter, his high-pitched questions filling the air. "Why's the sky so big, Elias?" "'Cause there's nothing to hold it down out here," Elias would rumble in response. Lena would watch them from the cabin doorway, a warmth spreading through her that had nothing to do with the strengthening sun. She was beginning to see the man beneath the gruff exterior, the patience he showed her son, the gentle way he handled a newborn calf, the integrity that was as solid and unyielding as the mountains. She found herself feeling a dangerous emotion. Gratitude was turning into respect, and respect was bordering on affection. It terrified her. Hope was a vulnerability she couldn't afford. Her life was temporary, a bargain struck out of desperation. She could not forget that. The real world intruded on their fragile peace one crisp spring day. Supplies were running low, and a trip to Clayton, the nearest town, was unavoidable. Elias loaded the wagon, his movements stiff. "You and the boy should stay here," he said. It wasn't a suggestion. "We're low on flour and salt," Lena countered, her chin set. "And Samuel needs new boots. I have a little money saved. I can pay for them." She had a few coins sewn into the hem of her dress, her last connection to her old life. Elias's jaw tightened. He didn't want to expose them to the prying eyes of the town. His arrangement with Lena was his own business, but he knew how it would look. He also knew she was right. He couldn't leave them for the 2 days it would take to get there and back, and Samuel's feet were nearly poking through the toes of his old boots. "Fine," he bit out. "But you stay close. Town's no place to wander." The trip to Clayton was tense. Lena sat on the wagon seat beside Elias, holding Samuel on her lap. The silence between them was no longer comfortable. It was fraught with the unspoken risks of what they were doing. They were presenting themselves to the world, and their carefully constructed peace felt as fragile as a pane of glass. Clayton was a single dusty street lined with false-fronted buildings. As they pulled up to the mercantile, Lena felt the stares like physical blows. Women paused, whispering behind their hands. Men tipped their hats to Elias, but their eyes lingered on her and Samuel, full of speculation. Elias's face was a granite mask. He helped her down from the wagon, his hand firm on her elbow, a small, proprietary gesture that did not go unnoticed. "Get what you need. he said, his voice low. I'll get the grain. Inside the mercantile, the air was thick with the smells of coffee, leather, and gossip. The proprietor's wife, a woman with a sour face and sharp eyes, looked Lena up and down. Help you? She asked, her tone implying Lena was something unpleasant that had been tracked in. Lena kept her head high. Flour, salt, and a pair of boys' boots, please. As she paid with her few coins, her eyes fell upon a notice tacked to a board by the door. It was a handbill, crudely printed. Her blood ran cold. Wanted for information. Reward offered. Concerning the whereabouts of Lena Walker and her son, Samuel, aged 4. Last seen leaving the vicinity of Laramie. Information to be given to Jedediah Walker. Her breath caught in her throat. Jedediah. His name on the paper was like a brand on her skin. He was looking for them, actively hunting them. The world tilted, the cheerful noise of the store fading to a dull roar in her ears. She snatched Samuel's hand, her knuckles white. Elias came back into the store just then, a sack of grain on his shoulder. He saw her face, the stark terror in her eyes, and followed her gaze to the handbill. He read it in a single, sweeping glance. His expression hardened, his eyes turning to chips of ice. Without a word, he reached out, tore the poster from the board, and crumpled it into a tight ball in his fist. He took the parcels from Lena's nerveless fingers, grabbed her arm, and steered her and a bewildered Samuel out of the store and back to the wagon. He all but threw their supplies in the back and helped them up onto the seat. He didn't speak until they were miles out of town, the dust of Clayton a bad memory behind them. He won't find you, Elias said, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't name. It was more than reassurance. It was a vow. But as Lena looked back at the empty road, she knew it was a vow that would soon be tested. The trouble she had run from now had a name and a direction. It was coming for them. The ride back to the ranch was shrouded in a heavy silence. The crumpled handbill felt like a malevolent presence in Elias's coat pocket. The fragile peace they had built over the past months had been shattered, replaced by the grim reality of Lena's past. When they finally reached the cabin, the sun was setting, painting the sky in violent streaks of orange and purple that mirrored the turmoil in Lena's heart. Elias unhitched the horses while Lena put a bewildered and tired Samuel to bed on the cot. When she emerged from behind the blanket partition, Elias was standing by the cold hearth, his back to her. He hadn't lit a fire. You need to tell me everything, he said, his voice flat. He turned to face her, his expression unreadable in the gathering gloom. No more half-truths. If I'm to help you, I need to know what I'm up against. Lena sank onto one of the chairs, her body trembling. The secret she had guarded so fiercely had become a poison, and it was time to let it out. My husband, Thomas, was a good man, she began, her voice barely a whisper. Kind. But his family, they were hard people. His older brother, Jedediah, most of all. She told him everything. She told him about Thomas's sudden death from a riding accident a year ago, and how, almost immediately, Jedediah had begun to circle. He ran the family farm, and he saw everything, and everyone, as his property. He didn't care about me, Lena said, her voice shaking with remembered fear and anger. He saw Samuel as just another mouth to feed until he was old enough to work. He told me as much. He said he'd find a place for me, and he would raise the boy himself. He meant to work him like an animal, Elias. To own him. My son. The last words were a choked sob. Thomas's will left me a small portion, enough to live on. But Jedediah hid it. He said I was a hysterical widow, that I had no claim. The law in that town, it listens to men like him. Men with land and money. I knew if I stayed, I would lose my son. So one night, I took Samuel, and I ran. Elias listened without interruption, his face a stony mask. When she finished, the only sound in the dark cabin was her ragged breathing. He walked to the hearth and began to build a fire, his movements deliberate and precise. He struck a match, and the kindling caught, casting flickering shadows across his grim face. This Jedediah, he said, his eyes on the growing flames. He's your boy's uncle. He could claim kinship. He could say you're an unfit mother, dragging a child through the wilderness. He will, Lena whispered. He'll say anything. He'll lie to the sheriff, to a judge, and they will believe him. Elias stared into the fire for a long time, the muscles in his jaw working. The cabin, which had become a sanctuary, now felt like a trap. They were isolated, vulnerable. Jedediah knew her name. He knew she had a son. It would only be a matter of time before he tracked her to this territory, asking questions in towns like Clayton. Finally, he turned away from the fire and looked directly at her. The flickering light carved deep lines into his face. "There's one way," he said, his voice low and steady. "One way to make sure he can't touch you. Or the boy." Lena looked at him, her heart pounding. "How?" "He has a claim on his brother's widow and his nephew," Elias stated, laying out the grim facts. "He has no claim on another man's wife. Or his son." The meaning of his words settled over her slowly, like a fall of snow. Her breath hitched. He couldn't possibly mean, "Marry me, Lena," he said. The words were not romantic. They were stark, practical, a piece of strategy in a war she hadn't known how to fight. "As my wife, you'd be under my name, my protection. The law would see you as part of my household. He'd have no right, no say. Samuel would be safe." He took a step closer, his gaze intense. "It wouldn't have to be a real marriage. Not in all ways. A contract. For your safety. For the boys." Lena stared at him, speechless. A marriage of convenience. A shield. It was a radical, terrifying solution. To tie herself to another man. To this quiet, lonely stranger who had saved her. But then she thought of Jedediah's cold, cruel face, and she looked at the sleeping form of her son. Elias was offering Samuel a future, a life free from fear. He was offering him a father's protection, something she alone could not provide. Her own feelings were a tangled mess of fear, gratitude, and a deeper, more confusing affection for this man. But her son's safety was the only thing that mattered. It was the North Star of her life. "The circuit judge is due in Prairie Ridge next month," Elias continued, filling the silence. "It's a bigger town, west of here. No one knows us there. We can ride out, be there when he arrives. We can make it legal before Jedediah gets this far." He was offering her a plan, a future, a life. She looked at his strong, calloused hands, hands that had built this house, that had been gentle with her son. She looked into his steady, honest eyes. She had trusted him with their lives. Now, he was asking her to trust him with their future. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, she gave him the only answer she could. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Elias. I will." The decision changed the air between them. The unspoken arrangement of boarder and landlord dissolved, replaced by the far more complex and intimate weight of fiancé and fiancée. Their interactions became freighted with a new self-awareness. A casual brush of hands as he passed her a plate felt charged. A shared look across the dinner table held a dozen unspoken questions. They were no longer just two people surviving together. They were two people preparing to bind their lives together, and the reason for it, the looming threat of Jedediah, was a constant, silent presence. Elias began to prepare for the journey to Prairie Ridge. He serviced the wagon, checked the horse's shoes, and packed supplies with a grim efficiency. He was more withdrawn than ever, his thoughts clearly turning over the confrontation that might lie ahead. Yet, in small ways, he was different. He started calling Samuel son sometimes, the word clumsy and unpracticed on his tongue, but it made the boy beam. One evening, he came in from the barn and handed Lena a small, scraggly bouquet of early prairie wildflowers. He just thrust them at her, mumbled something about them growing by the creek, and immediately busied himself with the fire, his face flushed under his beard. Lena put them in a tin can of water and set them on the table, where their vibrant colors seemed to defy the harshness of the world outside. They planned to leave in 2 days. The tension in the cabin was thick enough to cut with a knife. Every gust of wind sounded like hoofbeats. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Lena found herself watching the horizon constantly, her stomach a tight knot of anxiety. The morning they were to leave dawned gray and heavy. A nervous energy propelled them through their final tasks. Lena was packing a small satchel of clothes while Elias was hitching the wagon when Samuel, who was playing near the porch, let out a shout. "Riders, Mama. Riders are coming." Lena's blood turned to ice. She ran to the door and looked out. On the low ridge to the east, silhouetted against the bleak sky, were 3 horsemen. They were moving at a steady, deliberate pace, heading directly for the cabin. Elias was already walking back from the barn, his rifle held not threateningly, but ready. He stopped beside Lena at the doorway, his body a solid shield between her and the approaching men. "Go inside," he ordered, his voice dangerously quiet. "Take the boy. Stay away from the window." Lena grabbed Samuel's hand and pulled him back into the cabin, her heart hammering against her ribs. She hustled him behind the blanket partition. "Stay here, Samuel. Play with your horse and don't make a sound," she whispered, her voice trembling. He looked at her with wide, frightened eyes but nodded. She couldn't stay hidden. This was her fight, too. She crept to the edge of the window, peering through a small gap in the curtain. The riders had reached the edge of the yard and reined in. The man in the center was large and fleshy, with a self-important air and a cruel set to his mouth. Even from this distance, Lena recognized him instantly. Jedediah. Elias stood his ground in the middle of the yard, about 20 feet from his porch. He looked calm, immovable, a part of the very land he stood upon. "That's far enough." Elias's voice carried clearly in the still air. Jedediah smirked, a greasy, unpleasant expression. "I'm looking for a woman. My brother's widow. Name of Lena Walker. And my nephew, Samuel. I have reason to believe they're on this property." He spat on the ground, his eyes scanning the cabin with an owner's arrogance. "There's no one here by that name," Elias said, his voice flat. Jedediah's smirk widened. "Is that so? Funny. A man in Clayton described a woman and a boy traveling with you. Said she fit the description on my bill." He leaned forward on his saddle horn. "I'm not a man to be trifled with, friend. I'm here for what's mine. The boy is my blood. The law's on my side." "The law isn't here," Elias stated simply. "Only me. And I'm telling you to turn your horses around and leave my land." "Your land?" Jedediah laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. He swung down from his horse, his two companions remaining mounted, their hands resting near their hips. "I'll leave when I have my nephew." He started walking toward the cabin. It happened in a flash. Elias didn't raise his rifle. He simply moved, stepping directly into Jedediah's path. He was not as bulky as the other man, but he was taller and all lean, hard muscle. "I said that's far enough. You think you can stop me?" Jedediah sneered, his face turning red. He reached out to shove Elias aside. At that moment, the cabin door flew open. Lena stood there, her face pale, but her eyes blazing with a fire Elias had never seen. "Leave us alone, Jedediah," she cried, her voice ringing with defiance. "You have no right." Jedediah's face lit up with triumph. "Ah, there she is. The ungrateful runaway," his eyes fixed on her. "And carrying on with this, homesteader. I knew you were no good. Get the boy, Lena. We're leaving." "He's not going anywhere with you," Lena said, her voice shaking but firm. She took a step out onto the porch, placing herself in the open. "She's to be my wife," Elias said. The words were quiet, but they landed with the force of a hammer blow. Jedediah stopped dead, his sneer faltering for a second. He looked from Elias's implacable face to Lena's defiant one. He let out a bark of laughter. "His wife? You ain't married yet. She's still Thomas's widow, and that boy is still my kin. I have a claim." He took another step, his hand outstretched. "Give me the boy." "No," Lena screamed, and just as Jedediah lunged for the porch, Samuel, drawn by the shouting, ran out from behind his mother and clung to her skirts, crying. Jedediah's eyes gleamed. "There he is." Elias moved. He didn't draw a weapon. He simply planted himself directly in front of Lena and Samuel, a human wall. His voice, when he spoke, was low and resonant with absolute conviction. "On this land, what I say goes," he said, his eyes locked on Jedediah's. "She is under my protection. The boy is under my protection." He paused, and his next words sealed their fate and his own. "They are my family. You will leave my property now, or you will be removed." The threat was unmistakable. Jedediah stared at Elias, at the unwavering resolve in his eyes, at the easy way the rifle rested in the crook of his arm. He saw a man who was not afraid, a man who was defending his home, his family. He looked at his two hired men, who were now shifting uneasily in their saddles, clearly not keen on facing a determined man on his own ground. The fight had gone out of him, replaced by a sullen, impotent rage. "This isn't over," Jedediah snarled, spitting on the ground again. But he was backing away. He heaved himself back onto his horse. "You'll hear from the law about this." About harboring a runaway. About theft. You do that, Elias said calmly. You tell the law how you came onto my land, threatening my intended wife and her son. I'm sure they'll be very interested. Jedediah's face purpled. Defeated, he yanked his horse's reins, turning it so sharply the animal protested. With a final, venomous glare, he and his men spurred their horses and galloped away, their retreat a cloud of dust and humiliation. For a long moment after they were gone, no one moved. The only sounds were the sighing of the wind and Samuel's quiet sobs as he clung to his mother's dress. The immediate danger had passed, leaving a vacuum of shock and adrenaline in its wake. Elias slowly lowered the rifle, the tension draining from his shoulders. He turned, his gaze finding Lena's. The raw emotion in his eyes, relief, fierce protectiveness, and something deeper, something tender, made her breath catch. He took a step toward her, his boots crunching softly on the dirt. He didn't speak. He simply reached out and cupped her cheek, his thumb gently brushing away a tear she hadn't realized had fallen. The touch was electric, a current of unspoken understanding passing between them. In that single, simple gesture, the pretense of their arrangement fell away. This was no longer a contract. This was real. Samuel, sensing the shift, looked up from his mother's skirts and reached a small hand out toward Elias. Without hesitation, Elias knelt, his eyes never leaving Lena's, and pulled the boy into a hug. He wrapped one strong arm around Samuel, and with the other, he drew Lena down, until the three of them were huddled together in a tight, desperate, and beautiful embrace. They were a fortress of three against the world, right there in the dusty yard of the small, isolated cabin. The proposal was no longer about protection. It was about belonging. Later, after the sun had set and a quiet peace had descended once more upon the ranch, they sat at the table. Samuel was fast asleep on the cot, his carved horse clutched in his hand, his face relaxed and free from fear for the first time in a year. The stew Lena had made sat largely untouched between them. He'll be back, Lena said quietly, breaking the long silence. He won't give up. Elias looked at her, his gaze steady. We'll be ready for him. We'll still go to Prairie Ridge. We'll see the judge. He paused, and his voice softened. The offer still stands, Lena. To marry me. He reached across the table and took her hand, his calloused fingers wrapping gently around hers. But not just for protection. Not anymore. Tears welled in Lena's eyes, but this time she didn't fight them. They were tears of relief, of gratitude, of a profound and overwhelming joy that she had thought she would never feel again. This man, this quiet, solitary man, had not only saved her life, he had shown her its worth. He had stood for her, had claimed her and her son as his own, not out of duty, but out of something that looked so much like love it stole her breath. Yes, Elias, she whispered, her fingers tightening around his. Not just for protection. The next day, they did not leave for Prairie Ridge. The threat had passed for the moment, and a new sense of permanence had settled in the cabin. There was an unspoken agreement that this was home now, and they would defend it together. The blanket that had served as a partition came down. That evening, Elias didn't lay his bedroll by the fire. He simply took the extra blanket and went to sleep in the barn, affording Lena and Samuel the cabin, a gesture of respect so profound it made her heart ache. Life resumed its rhythm, but the melody had changed. The silences were no longer awkward or uncertain. They were comfortable, filled with a deep, shared understanding. Laughter came more easily. Samuel's chatter filled the small cabin, and Elias's rumbling responses became more frequent. He taught the boy to ride, sitting him in front of him on his steady old mare. Their two forms a single silhouette against the vast prairie sky. Lena found herself humming as she worked, a thing she hadn't done in years. She planted the small garden Elias had tilled for her, her hands in the rich soil, feeling a sense of belonging to this place, this land. She watched Elias, saw the way his eyes followed her, the small, almost imperceptible smiles that touched his lips when he watched her with Samuel. He was a man starved of affection, and she and her son had brought him a feast. One evening, weeks after the confrontation with Jedediah, Elias was sitting on the porch steps, watching the stars begin to prick the deep velvet of the sky. Lena came out and sat beside him, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders. For a long while, they sat in silence, the vast, quiet expanse of the plains stretching out before them. "I never thanked you properly," Lena said softly. "Nothing to thank me for," he rumbled. "You gave my son a home," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "You gave him a father." Elias turned his head, his profile stark in the moonlight. "He gave me a son," he corrected quietly. He looked at her then, and the guard he kept so firmly in place was gone. His eyes held a universe of old pain and new hope. "And you brought the light back into this house, Lena. I'd forgotten what it looked like." He leaned in, slowly, giving her every chance to turn away. She didn't. She met him halfway, her eyes fluttering shut as his lips, chapped and gentle, met hers. It was not a kiss of passion, but of homecoming. It was a kiss that tasted of wood smoke, coffee, and redemption. It was the sealing of a promise made not with words, but with courage and compassion. He pulled back and looked out at the dark land, his arm now resting protectively around her shoulders. He watched the stars burn over the silent plains, over the roof of the cabin where a small boy slept safely in his bed. The child had his shelter. And Elias Thorne, a man who thought his heart was as barren as the winter ground, felt it begin to bloom. He looked at the woman leaning against him, her head resting on his shoulder, and knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he had found his home. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. This story showed love and heroism where least expected. What was your favorite moment of connection between them? Tell us in the comments.